Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Storm. Best last name for a guest, I think, potentially thus far. The competition has begun. You must get exhausted of people commenting on your name. But anyways, thank you so much for being here with us. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, sure. So first, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to apologize to your guests to your listeners and viewers for my nasal voice. I'm getting over a head cold. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a philosopher and historian. As a historian, I work especially on religion and science. More specifically, I do archival work in multiple language to trace how the categories religion and science have been constructed, contested, and remade across Europe and East Asia. And then with my philosopher hat, I work on like knowledge, power, and meaning in the human sciences. Or maybe what you wanted to know is I'm currently a professor in the Department of Religion and chair of Science and Technology Studies at Williams College. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, the nasally voice actually makes you sound more prophetic. It's got like that
Okay.
Bob Dylan. I think it's a good. It's like Phoebe on Friends when she loses her voice. Everyone starts listening to her music. So, yeah. Anyways.
So one of the books that you published not too well, I guess it's a little bit in the past now. It was the Myth of Disenchantment.
Yeah.
Which is great because it stands as somewhat of a critique of the established narrative of how the Western world is going. To that extent, can you help for our listeners who might be unfamiliar with the concept of disenchantment? What even is that?
Yeah, sure. So part of the thing I'm interested in the book is the different ways that term disenchantment might be defined. But in the book, I depart from a particular text by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. It's actually just just outside of my arm's reach. But Dialektik der Aufklärung, the dialectic of enlightenment. And in that work, Horkheimer and Adorno define disenchantment in terms of the end of belief in myth, magic or occult powers, and the extirpation of animism and belief in spirits. So basically, it's the end of myth, it's the end of magic or occult powers, and the end of belief in animism, spirits, ghosts, and stuff like that. And they associate it with the rupture of modernity, basically. And more specifically, they're getting it from the German sociologist Max Weber, who famously coined this phrase, die Entzauberung der Welt, literally the demagicking or the desorcering of the world. Anyway, so by disenchantment, I mean the claim that the contemporary modern world, however that's defined, is a world in which people no longer believe in magic or occult powers, myths, or spirits, or ghosts, or things like that. Yeah.
So like 1,000 years ago, you could believe in fairies. In fact, many people did. But today, it's sort of exotic if you have any sort of those beliefs.
Yeah, stuff like that. Like there's a famous text by a guy named Keith Thomas on religion and the decline of magic, where he says, just 100 years ago, everybody believed in fairies and magic and astrology and what have you, but today nobody believes in that stuff anymore. Yeah, and it turns out, as just to sort of anticipate, that this narrative is kind of false. And before I do that, I want to make sure I'm distinguishing something. So, in maybe popular culture, notions of disenchantment are often collapsed into notions of secularization. I mean, like academic popular culture. So, and one of the things I'm doing in the book is disaggregating those two. So secularization, which we could understand as a decline of the authority of organized religion or a decrease in church attendance, or what have you, turns out to be a very different phenomena than belief in spirits and magic and stuff like that. And indeed, based on some sociological evidence I survey in the first chapter of the book, there's even inverse correlation. So the more folks get unchurched, the more they start to see their particular, religious authorities vanishing, or they stop going to church, often the more likely they are to believe in things like ghosts or magic or witchcraft. So there's a way in which, as this Daily Mail article put it a couple decades ago, kind of inflammatorily, God is out and the ghosts are back in. So there's at least those two things are separable. So, yeah, so that's the other thing that I'm interested in exploring in the book, is how, the difference between disenchantment and secularization. Yeah.
So this alleged disenchanting, where the world is disenchanted of fairies, magic, gods, supernatural anythings of any kind, and disenchanted of myths. You're arguing that it is itself a myth, that
Yeah.
the disenchantment of myths is a myth that we've bought into in our modern age, and actually this disenchantment hasn't been what we thought it was. It hasn't played out the way we thought it was. Why? You started to hint at that, but could you give us the whole picture now? Why is
Sure.
that a myth?
Yeah, so in the first instance, I'm using a particular definition of myth as a kind of prefabricated trope that transposes meaning from one domain to another. So I'm calling these myths, insofar as I'm drawing on the Greek meaning of the word mythos as story or narrative, but I'm getting rid of the assumption that myths are necessarily archaic. So I have in my myths that are repeated narrative symbols, like the death of God or Achilles' heel or the naked truth or something. But they also fundamentally function as narratives that we tell about the past, and they're things that often people take for granted in one way or another. And in many cases, they're false, but I don't want to assume that all myths are necessarily false. So just to be clear, in this case, it is a false myth. And that is because it's been historically understood as a kind of sociological description of popular belief. But if we look at survey data, and there's a bunch of surveys that I examined in the first part of the book. Let's take the U.S. for example. There's a fairly famous survey that folks at Baylor did, that tried to look at paranormal belief, and it suggested that, according to, paranormal is not my preferred word, but it's their word. But in any case, that something like 73% of Americans have at least one paranormal belief. And if we look at data that I didn't talk about in the book, but that's come out subsequently, looking at survey data, something like 83% of Americans believe in the existence of angels, demons, or ghosts. So people have not stopped believing in their examples of paranormal things like psychic powers and witchcraft and magic. So that's not gone. And indeed, based on the survey data, and if you think of it as in terms of quote unquote animism, or the belief in beings of different kinds of spirits of different sorts, even discounting belief in God, where many Americans believe in God, many Americans believe in angels, demons, or ghosts. And we get similar data from Western Europe, even as church attendance is quite lower in much of Western European world. And then, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the sociological data. If you go to almost any coffee shop in the United States, you'll probably see like little flyer or co-op or something. You can see flyers for different kinds of things. In my coffee shop, for instance, I see flyers for things like energy healing and Reiki, or stuff about tarot readings. Many towns in America have in them have like fortune tellers, palm readers, or people who are professional psychics of one sort or another. If you just take the kind of evidence that scholars looking outside the quote unquote West have used as evidence for enchanted belief in places like South Asia or Southeast Asia, if you turn that same kind of anthropological gaze on contemporary North America or Western Europe, you see very similar kinds of patterns. People who believe in paranormal, etc. And then also based on evidence that I've looked at again since the book, on an economic level, this stuff is huge. So the psychic fortune-telling services, according to one data point that I've got, are about the size in the United States of online dating in terms of their economic impact. It's really huge. And if anything, it seems to go up in periods of economic precarity. So it went up in the Great Recession. I think it's probably climbing again now. And that's just on the book. People who are listing their income sources as doing different kinds of fortune telling or what have you. It doesn't include like off the book stuff, so-called underground economy stuff, like people at a bar who will tell your fortune for a $20 bill or a beer or whatever, do tarot for you or something like that. So all that, and if we look at publishing, we can see that the constantly at the top of the Amazon bestseller lists are things like books, New Age books, books about magic, books about astrology, books about ghosts. And there's a whole industry of YouTube and other forms of so-called haunted media that explore how, the either debunking, but mostly not, haunted houses, cryptids, the whole thing. All that is to say, like the data just really pushes against the idea that the contemporary United States and really the globe is disenchanted. But to make one last hedge, I do think that the myth of disenchantment is a real myth in that many people believe in it. And they believe that the modern world is or should be disenchanted. And it has two kinds of real effects I trace in the book. It contributes to its own self-fulfillment in various fields where people try and push out the magic, or they push out believers in different kinds of paranormal, etc. beliefs. But it also is self-refuting in that many contemporary American occultists, occult revivalists, and not just in the US, across the globe, have often themselves promoted disenchantment, even as they claim to provide an antidote to it. So the Croleys of this world, the Helena Blavatskys of this world, the Dion Fortunes of this world often described their society as disenchanted, even as they were the ones bringing the magic back. So it's a kind of self-refuting myth in that particular way. And then the last piece of evidence is it turns out to be a really old myth. So if you go back versions of that narrative, a trope that suggests that magic is located in the past, or that the fairies are no longer around. If you go back to Chaucer's The Wife of Bath in about whatever it is, 1380, says, the land was once full of fairies, but no one can see them anymore. This is not a denial of fairies, but a denial of their contemporary visibility or presence, but it's actually one of the tropes built into the notion of fairies. Similarly, many quote-unquote magic books or grimoires from that same period, from roughly late medieval grimoires, describe themselves as the last work that preserves magic from the ancient age of Solomon or what have you, even as they describe a world that is otherwise disenchanted. So the disenchantment myth emerged much earlier than it got any kind of sociological purchase. There, I did a little monologue, and I'll shift out now. Yeah.
So we've been telling ourselves the same story for a long, long time, that magic is in the past and we need to bring it back. And that's something that you've traced back for centuries.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, isn't that even the original impulse of Greek philosophy, was to leave behind the mythological gods and to try to do more, or at least how we've characterized it in hindsight, right?
Yeah, it's definitely how we've characterized it in hindsight. And one of the things that I look at in the book is how specifically that narrative about ancient Greece developed, for instance, too. The idea that ancient Greece was a shift from mythos to logos, so from myth to the word, but ignoring the fact that logos had a richly, what we might say, enchanting quality to it. You can see why, for instance, in the New Testament, the logos is the God, the word was with God, and, I think that's what sorry, I'm a little too stuffy to quote my New Testament from memory, but the word was God. Darn it.
The word was with God and the word was God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's logos. And that logos was quite a significant term also in Greek Neoplatonism and indeed in Greek Platonic circles, where logos was understood not as a kind of stripped down rational logic, but something much more akin to a kind of structuring principle of language and world that were often taken together in one way or another. And so there are more and more ways we can complicate it, but the idea that one of the other features of the myth of disenchantment that I'm interested in the book is that it was a myth in search of its own origins. So in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when folks first started articulating in, let's say, more academic circles this myth of disenchantment, they then tried to figure out, well, when did we get disenchanted? And they often located it on different points, either the Greek transition from myth to logic, or they focused on the Protestant Reformation, or they focused on the Enlightenment, or the birth of modern science, or the printing press. But that story that sometime in the past there had been a rupture is a story that we can even pin down to basically a bunch of dudes in the early 19th century who were looking to recreate or reinvent a past. And so that was also supposed to be part of a story about what made the West distinctive from the rest of the world. And that was in a period of increasing colonization and a whole bunch of other things. But it was also one in which there were various particular new things beginning to come onto the scene in terms of philosophy, etc. So it was a myth in search of its own origins. And so that's when people like Nestle, who is one of the first thinkers to write from myth to logic in ancient Greece, his text emerges in this period. The Renaissance is reinvented as a backward described period by Jules Michelet, and the Enlightenment is also constructed retroactively as a periodization instead of a movement and some other things. So yeah.
It's perhaps totally by, or what maybe what you would call synchronicity, but my coffee cup that I accidentally grabbed today.
What is it? I can't quite see.
Oh,
What
it's
is it?
ghosts.
Oh, ghosts. Yeah.
It's it's a picture of ghosts. It's what maybe you would call that a synchronicity. The re-enchantment of the world, that even my coffee cup has ghosts on it, right?
It's because they're what wakes you up, just like coffee. It's the perfect merging of things.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. So it's funny that as well, like on the way over here, I saw a statistic which from a pollster, and I wasn't even looking for this. It popped up on my Facebook feed, which there was a poll of, do you consider yourself spiritual? And people would rank their spirituality. Those born in 1940 gave 8% said they're not spiritual at all. Those born in the 2000s, it was 12%, a whopping 4% increase. It's virtually unchanged over time. Even as, the similar statistics show that organized religions are losing adherents. People are remaining about as spiritual or have some level of spiritual beliefs. So it's just kind of funny that, like, I saw this on the way over here,
Yeah, I mean, that's great. Yeah, and that fits the evidence. Yeah, totally. So, yeah, the idea that there was sometime a great falling away of that belief just isn't, there just isn't evidence for it. I mean, there is evidence for changing. I'm not going to say that those beliefs haven't changed. And one of the other things I'm interested in the book is how notions of ghosts, for instance, changed. For instance, with the rise of early cinema, we start to get the ghost as transparent, for instance. In older notions of the ghost in the Western context don't have like semi-transparent ghosts. That's something that emerges with double exposure and the rise of early photo, film, and cinema. And so, for instance, what people have understood ghosts or how they fit in have changed, for instance, and what people understood to be spirits is a very mobile, flexible category, which has shifted over time. And so I'm not describing like some kind of uniform stasis, but at the very least, what doesn't happen is this kind of disenchantment. Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit, but there seems to be sort of two competing motives here. There's the motive to disenchant the world, this narrative that sort of is self-perpetuating, the desire to see the world as disenchanting, maybe as a good thing, or a desire to push out enchanted views from, it sounds like mostly from academia. But at the same time, even as organized religions are going away, the world, people continue to believe in what we call enchanted beliefs at the same time. So I guess my question to you is, on the one hand, what is motivating this desire for disenchantment? You picked up on this a little bit, especially, the conversation about colonialism. And at the same time, what is motivating, I ask you to play maybe armchair psychologist, what is motivating people to continue to believe in an enchanted cosmos?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the first case, what's motivating them to disenchant, I think, as I talk about in the book a little bit, there's, one is colonialism. One is a desire toward a certain kind of scientificity within academic disciplines. So academic disciplines that want to seem scientific, try and strip away superstitions. This is especially true in the human sciences, the humanities and social sciences, where often I and my colleagues have anxiety about our relationship to the sciences. And so they're like, oh, no, don't, we're a serious science, like psychology, we're a serious science. We don't have any, ghost belief in here or any psychical belief in here or whatever. Even as many early psychologists and psychoanalysts were very invested in psychical research. But there's also a third, even more basic sociological thing, which is, if you look at the contemporary landscape, so they're like 73% of Americans have paranormal beliefs, but they don't have the same paranormal beliefs. And believers in one, let's say, enchanted belief often are dismissive of others. So folks who believe in, for instance, the reality of demons might think that UFOs are really just demons. Whereas there are people who believe in UFOs and psychical powers who think that there's no such thing as demons, right? And so what happens when you get increasing belief fragmentation is that you start to get people thinking of the other people's beliefs as silly and wanting to either disabuse them of it or what have you. And also even as people start to search for different kinds of beliefs and their own beliefs diversify. So you end up with people who, your neighbors might have very, very different sets of beliefs than you today in a way that perhaps they mightn't have 200 or 250 years ago or something like that. So you get more so-called fragmentation. Why do the beliefs persist? And I'm not alas, not a real psychologist, so I can't say something terribly intelligible about that. But I can say that for most of the history of the field that I was intervening, the opposite question was taken as the problem. People were like, why did we get rid of these beliefs? And then I was kind of like, well, wait, did we get rid of these beliefs? And then I was like, no, we didn't. And so now we have something new to explain. And some features of that, what are the explanations for why those beliefs persist? There are a lot of possible explanations. One of those that some folks other than me have explored with greater credibility is psychological. So there's a guy, I think Lebowski, I'll have to check my footnotes to get his full details, but there's evidence that some of the things that we might want to call quote unquote magical belief are just side effects of psychological processes. For instance, and I used to do this in one of the classes with students, if I take 2 glasses of water or 2 jugs of water and I write like poison on one, and the students can see me that they're both full of water, and then I write poison, and then I have a cup in front of me and say, pick which cup, you can drink from either cup, either jug of water, and then the students go in a line and they pour up their glasses or whatever and they drink from it. Almost always the one that has poison, they're barely drinking it, and the other one, they drink all the way down. Like something makes them uncomfortable about that, even though they know that there's no particular reason that they should be avoiding, the cup that says poison or the pitcher that says poison just because I've written it on it. Similarly, there's some evidence, and I think this is a little bit thinner, but Stuart Guthrie's book, Faces in the Clouds, talks about default anthropomorphic orientations in human cognitive apparatuses, such that we have a tendency when we are confronted with, and I think this part is true, but his explanation of what it entails is false. When we see, like clouds with strange shapes, we often see faces in them. When we see things in the forest, that we have a sort of an overly sensitive anthropomorphic detector. We're more likely to imagine the things that are happening to us are being caused by agents with personalities rather than, the refrigerator door bangs me. I'm like, damn you, fridge, why did you hit me as an impulse, instead of being like it's an inanimate object. I just punched it. Those are some possible explanations, but you could also come up with theological or ontological explanations. Anyway, I don't know why. I just know that historically, with my, it just didn't occur as a broad trajectory. And today, across the globe, most people in not just everywhere believe in something like spirits. Not everybody, but a high disproportionate percentage of people do. And they're quite different in those beliefs. So I'm not trying to say that they believe in the same thing or that they even share those beliefs, but yeah.
That's actually... Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just going to say, I liked that last illustration because I've always felt like I have a personal relationship with my fridge. But I wonder, I feel like the secularist or the person who pushes forth the myth of disenchantment and secularization, the kind of attitude or response I might hear to some of this is, well, yes, supernatural, superstitious beliefs persist. And that's why we need more education, because education and information is what's going to rid us of all of this. And so they almost have this like, yes, spiritual beliefs persist, but those people are less educated, less intelligent. Are there actual demographic statistics around what kind of people are remaining spiritual in the 21st century? What do they say or not say?
Yeah, so so this has been somewhat extensively studied, and and it turns out that it's not education correlated. What paranormal or beliefs, that's the term the sociologists use, what paranormal beliefs you have is very tightly keyed to demographic details like education and things like quote unquote race or ethnicity or what have you. But that you have them isn't education coded. So let me give you a more concrete example. People who go to college become less likely to believe in demonic possession and more likely to believe in ghosts. There's also like a heavily co-occurrence of I think it's like white men and belief in Bigfoot. So I mean, it's just like. What beliefs people have definitely changes. And I will say, I do think education is very important. And I think there are not enough folks sticking up for education in our historical moment. But I don't think it has that stripping away effect. It just changes. It changes a lot of things. But and I think, but anyway, yeah.
I just want to see a study done on why white men in particular love Bigfoot. I think that would be a fascinating study worth having.
Yeah.
We did do an episode with a primate anthropologist from Idaho State University who did believe in Bigfoot a long time ago. Jonathan twisted my arm into having one, so we have that episode.
And now he's decided to leave the podcast. Now he's realized that we're not serious people.
That is our least serious episode we ever did. That is the least one ever, only because you twisted my arm. So, on a more serious note, you talk about in the book, you talk about the quote unquote scientific revolution and enlightenment, and you debunk essentially the idea that this was a time where magic was on the decline. That was a medieval thing, and then you have people like Francis Bacon, the fathers of modern science, and these Enlightenment philosophers who come along and remove the magic from the world. What do you have to say about that? Like, what's wrong with that story?
Yeah, so that turns out to be a myth too. I mean, and a very widely repeated one, but one that turns out to be a retrospective creation. And in particular, folks like Francis Bacon were deeply committed to, so he was deeply committed to alchemy, actually was pro-magic. He describes, and I have the quotations in the book itself, but wanting to recall philosophy from its vanities and make it more like magic. Because magic was pragmatic and practical. Many of the folks in the scientific revolution, I'm just about to teach a course actually on the scientific revolution next semester in the the college that I teach at. And it turns out that many of the folks in the scientific revolution, whether we're talking Bacon or Giordano Bruno or Copernicus or Kepler or Isaac Newton, were heavily, or Robert Boyle, were engaged in, often had a belief in like Protestant presuppositions around the nature of divine, like Francis Bacon in particular had a notion of a post-lapsarian human condition where after the fall, humans had lost our ability to clearly see the world, and what science was supposed to do was restore us to a kind of Adamic wisdom as perfect for an apocalyptic era with coming messianic expectations. So science was a kind of redemptive force in Bacon, or at least knowledge was. And tons of those, so Isaac Newton, for instance, spent more of his time doing alchemy than he did doing physics, and indeed his alchemical writings. And he looking for codes in the Bible, and those texts vastly outstrip his texts located in physics. Like, I bet if you had asked him at a party and gotten him to be honest about it, like, what do you think of yourself? He would have described himself as an alchemist or as a virtuosi, as a kind of alchemical virtuoso, much more intently. I mean, the word physicist is an anachronism, so he wouldn't have been able to use that. But so this is, and this was central across a whole range of folks. Like many of the astronomers that we think of as central to the astronomical part of the scientific revolution were themselves also practicing astrologers. Kepler was casting horoscopes, so you don't need, so that break is very much a retroactive construction, not 100%, insofar as folks like Francis Bacon was trying to make alchemy less obscurantist and more publicly available. So part of what Francis Bacon wants to do is he wants to take out the jargon and the language and make it more accessible to collective critique. In his and in that respect, he's kind of sort of more, as I say in the book, Protestantized magic. And he has a kind of anti-Catholicism built into his project that's interesting or complexifying. But all that is to say, that isn't the moment. The so-called scientific revolution is not the moment that those beliefs were stripped away. And then in the generations after that, this notion of enlightenment and then later retroactively constructed period of the Enlightenment did dedicate itself to getting rid of superstitions. And that's something that it's a language inherited from Bacon, but what fit into those categories of superstitions was much more flexible than people imagined. So many of the philosophers themselves, as critical as they were of, let's say, organized religion and ritual practices, were promoting kinds of deism, but we're also interested in like natural magic and alchemy, and often granted the reality of occult forces and things like that. So, I don't want to say again that nothing changed in those epochs, but it was not it was not like a radical ruptural moment in the way that story is usually told. Go ahead. Sorry. No, sorry. You asked. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So basically, we have in our mind that there, we might say the medieval era was the era of magic and that the modern era is the era of science. But then you actually read someone like Francis Bacon, where his science is a form of magic in that sense. Is that correct?
Yes, and also things that we associate with the Middle Ages in the popular imaginary weren't actual to the Middle Ages. So, for instance, people in the Middle Ages didn't believe that the world was flat. That is a 19th century construction projected backward. There are more flat earthers today than there were flat earthers in the past. Similarly, witchcraft persecutions, although there was some policing of malefacea, so curses in earlier periods, the idea of persecuting witches was an early modern phenomena, picking up in the 15th century, not a medieval phenomena, and gaining steam in the same period when we often think of things like the scientific revolution happening rather than vanishing. So a lot of that, so there's this whole back-created Middle Ages that turns out to be an anachronism. One of the red herrings is this notion of the supernatural. Well, so it turns out that that term, the supernatural, emerges from a particular theological compromise. To sort of abbreviate a bunch of this history a little bit, there's a Renaissance, a revival of Aristotle, early, I think it's like roughly 12th century revival of Aristotle, and two notions of nature are pushed together. Notions of naturalis, which was a notion, a Latinate notion of nature as a kind of law governing structure, and a Greek notion of nature as physis, as constantly productive. And they were related now via Aristotle to questions of God and divine laws. And the question became, can God, does God or natural law, like, is God beyond natural laws? If there's a miracle, is a miracle something that is against nature? Because if nature is divine laws, then it seemed like God would be acting against himself. Or are miracles just natural because they are the implication of divine laws? And so in that context, there are a bunch of debates, and a new term emerges. In addition to natural and contranatural, this new term supernatural appears to describe those breaking of the rules that are above nature, that are sort of divine suspensions of that order. But what folks don't know is that in that period, God was the only supernatural entity. Things like witchcraft and magic were defined as naturalis or contranaturalis. They were either unnatural or preternatural, the extension of natural phenomena. So one of the most famous texts in the persecution of witchcraft, the Malleus Maleficarum, for instance, insists that witches operate according to demons, but demons are real, and demons operate according to amplifying the properties of natural things and creating occasional illusions. So witches are, and so the devil becomes the primary figure of nature, or of, he's constrained within the natural world. He's not supernatural. God is the only one that's supernatural. The devil either deceives people or when he's being contranatural, or he acts by preternatural, which is he amplifies things that are unusual in nature, but otherwise he can't break any of God's natural laws. But very early on, this notion of supernatural starts to not make sense to people. They want to be able to say things like, that term is promiscuous and complicated and messy. And then by the 17th and 18th century, when that term, people start encountering other parts of the world, they're like, oh, is this belief supernatural or not? It turns out that most cultures don't have this natural supernatural distinction, so it also doesn't globalize very well. So I think closer to what many people who have practiced magic in the European historical context use the term preternatural to describe it, which is basically an analog of our paranormal. So and that there's more continuities there between notions of the paranormal and the magical. It's not the like Harry Potter, you wave a wand and you just say some stuff and something happens or whatever. Like that. There may be some wand waving, but it has a much more complicated ontology behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a friend who recently told me that there were certain Catholic medieval theologians who would talk about telepathy as a natural human capacity, which feels like a category error for us. It's like, no, telepathy by its very nature is a supernatural ability. And yet that's that shift in language, right?
Yeah, and even today, people who do psychical research or paranormal research often want to insist on telepathy as not supernatural, but as something that humans are capable of doing in one way or another. So so there's a long even that notion of paranormal and parapsychological And all of that emerges from a conversation around powers and powers of the mind, but often describing things that in earlier periods were understood under the broader banner of things like natural magic or magic. So yeah, although there are a lot of new categories too, so I don't want to flatten things too much, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, a lot of your book spends time on the early figures in the field of religious studies. Why do you focus there?
Yeah, so part of what I'm doing through when I'm doing the book is I'm ticking through the various humanistic disciplines, the human sciences, so the humanities and social sciences, and I'm looking at where in the various disciplines this notion of disenchantment gained purchase. And in particular, I note that it mostly happens in the 19th century, and it often happens alongside various occult and spiritualist revivals. And one key case study for that is, there are many disciplines in the book, but a whole pair of chapters around religious studies, and figures like Friedrich Max Müller, who's often considered the founder of religious studies. The word religious studies itself is basically an attempt to Americanize the German Religionswissenschaft, so the science of religion or whatever. Anyway, he's considered the pioneer of religious studies. We don't really read him today anymore, but he was once considered the founder of the discipline as something separate from theology. In any case, he often described his project in some of his later works as a kind of theosophy. And this is in a period when the Theosophical Society, which I've also spent some time on, and as Seth knows, just co-edited a book around, is blooming really. And so it turns out that the Theosophical Society, which is basically a very influential global movement that sets the stage for much of what becomes the New Age religion in the United States and Europe, but also is this vector for the transmission of Asian and East Asian, let's say, practices and traditions into the American vernacular or the global vernacular. Anyway, that is closely related to the birth of religious studies. So, and our vocabulary, things like reincarnation or aura or subtle body, those things that seem, even the language, New Age, all that was filtered through this Theosophical Society. And it turns out that many figures in religious studies in the history of the discipline were either theosophists or theosophy adjacent. So part of the other interesting thing is that this notion of disenchantment often takes hold in disciplines that are in the process of reckoning with their cultural context, which often involves belief in spirits, occultism, or magic. So that's kind of why I'm focusing on that. Yeah.
Yeah, even like language, like a lot of my students, good vibe, it's got a bad energy, or bad, you mentioned aura as well. Like vibes is short for vibrations and stuff. It's like so much of our language, we don't even think about it, can trace its origins back to some of these occultists like Blavatsky.
Yeah, totally.
Something else that you talked about, the Spear-Whorf hypothesis in one of your books, where, most famously shows up in Arrival. John, is it the first science fiction movie to get nominated for Best Film? You're the film expert.
Arrival? No, I can't imagine it was.
Okay.
So,
I thought it was.
Even Star Wars got nominated for Best Picture.
Oh, that's fair.
The first one.
Okay. Well, there's something about it. Anyway, so Arrival, where this idea that language shapes our perception of reality. You actually trace that to like the original publication of that idea was in a Theosophical Journal, which is an occult journal.
Yeah, totally. So, so scholars who focus on that particular notion of language, sometimes called linguistic relativism or linguistic determinism, often identify the origins of that in the writings of two particular dudes, Sapir and Whorf. And it turns out that the version of it that's depicted in Arrival, this idea that language like fully determines thought, was particularly articulated by this guy, Benjamin Whorf, in a text that was originally published in a Theosophical Journal. And Whorf had a different set of implications that he drew from it, which is to say, part of his notion that language influences or controls thought was in a background context of discussions of mantras and the idea that you can hold certain kinds of mental thought forms or mind images to radically reconfigure your thinking. So anyway, I have a chapter in that volume where I look at how that particular view was deeply connected to broader theosophical notions of language. Now, there are earlier antecedents in moderate versions of that argument that go back quite a bit earlier to thinkers like Humboldt and arguably back to Plato, where the idea is that language, there's a distinction. Rhetoric has the capacity to persuade people, or language has the capacity to maybe change how you see things somewhat. But that's not the cool, funky arrival where, like, you think in a new language, your perception of the world is fundamentally different. And that kind of radical version of it is the version that is the theosophical version. So, yeah, and it's in Arrival. It's also in Samuel Delaney's, what is it, Babel 17. That's a fun sci-fi novel. That uses a version of that. It's also in China Mieville's Embassy Town. Like, is it Embassy Town or Embassyville? But anyway, yeah, it's a common theme in sci-fi circles, but it's also a philosophy of language that was associated in particular also with some versions of what gets called post-structuralism or, postmodernist notions of language. And anyway, so it's interesting that has theosophical antecedents and, yeah, and I found Worf's lodge records. He was a member of the society, of the Theosophical Society as well. So that's there in my
I love
chapter.
that you just connected the film Arrival to like the book/movie The Secret, where like thought, like manifesting through thought and words somehow creates the reality. Like, I love it. I love it.
Totally.
There's like there's at least a common thread that's uniting them. And just to clarify for our listeners, what you're not saying is that like the field of religious studies was born out of occultism, but rather that there's always this conversation going where you can see that it's not as if religious studies is this disenchanting thing and then there's the occult people who are sitting marginalized on the side. There's always been this sort of conversation going on.
Totally. Yeah. Religious studies has always, for its history as an independent academic discipline, has always united those different kinds of influences and actors. So you've had people in religious studies with rich theological agenda, or you've had people who were secularizing disenchanters, and you've also had plenty of occultists or seekers or questers. So it's just been a meeting ground of a lot of different views. And it shouldn't be surprising because it's often people's intense and sometimes idiosyncratic interests in religion that draw them to religious studies in the first place. So it's just a very diverse field of attitudes. And whereas scholarship has historically pretended that religious studies was both secularizing and Protestant and treated those as identical, I want to tease out both the ways that is only been, both of those have been factors in the discipline, but have never owned the conversation, and they're not necessarily the same thing. And there are plenty of counterexamples and necessarily very influential ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the origin of science, the history of science. We've talked a little bit about the origin of religious studies. I want to shift a little bit while we have time to psychology.
Sure.
Because there's one figure that was, when I was going through your book, that was kind of shocking. Because when I hear the name Sigmund Freud, I usually think of him as sort of the arch skeptic, the chief disenchanter, the great, like he's sort of like right there in the middle of someone who could explain human psychology from I don't want to necessarily say a naturalistic perspective, but he seems like one of the chief guys you would think would be motivated by a disenchantment. But you definitely you definitely put some holes in that narrative. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Yeah, and that is the dominant view of Freud, is that he's a disenchanter who's, like an arch secularist, anti-religion, anti-superstition, etc. And so, and that's a narrative about Freud that both took hold in a bunch of different circles, both among Jungian circles who want to distinguish Jung from Freud by saying like, Freud, he was this skeptic and he was trashing Jung who had his own mystical project, and that's taken hold more broadly in the history of psychoanalysis and public presentations of Freud. So yeah, it turns out it's false. So, and it turns out it's false in a couple of different ways. In the first instance, one of the things I like to do, because I'm like very pedantic historian, is I look at different editions of different works. And in Freud's interpretation of dreams, there's a telling a set of footnotes he adds in a later edition where he refers to what he calls I forget, like the amazing mystic Karl Duprel, and who he says anticipates his own theory of the unconscious. And the interpretation of the dreams is where Freud first lays out his articulation of the unconscious. And so you might want to know, like, who's this? I think, like, maybe I translated in the book is this brilliant mystic, Karl Duprel. So who is this guy, and why is Freud saying that a mystic is brilliant? And so it turns out that Karl Duprel was a very influential German, Baron Karl Duprel, a very influential German philosopher and mystic, who was very influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer and others, but wrote a book he called Philosophy of Mysticism, and was an early advocate for psychical powers, the idea that people's minds have the capacity to transcend space and time, and all these strange and funky things. But he also uses the term unconscious in his works, and before Freud, and describes our conscious thought as only like the surface of a deeper unconscious. For Duprel, that deeper unconscious is also where things like animal magnetism and what we would call paranormal and psychical powers originate. And so first, Freud admits, in a way, to being influenced by Duprel by a mystic in one of his most signature theories. Now, Freud was very skeptical of religion and organized religion. You might see this in Moses and Monotheism, or Future of an Illusion, where he, in different respects, describes religion in psychoanalytic terms in ways that don't make it look very good. But Freud himself, and this is the second piece of evidence, came to believe in the reality of telepathy and psychical powers, and he got less skeptical about those as he got older, not more skeptical. And he referred to his own, first of all, private mysticism. He was interested in numbers, and he had all these associations with numbers that he was aware was psychologically, he was aware that he was a neurotic. Like, one of the things I love about Freud is that he didn't, you get a cliche of Freud looking down his nose at everybody, but no, he was aware of his own neuroses. That's part of what allowed him to articulate his particular model. And he does describe belief in telepathy as a central feature of so-called a primitive thought or savage thought. But then later he describes himself as a believer in telepathy. So he's sort of suggesting that, and then in one work that wasn't published in his lifetime but was published after his death, he begins to speculate. I think I'm right about this. It might have been published in his lifetime, but in a minor publication, that early. In the evolution of humanity, humans might have communicated telepathically before we had language. So this is not to say that the so-called primitive peoples believe in telepathy is not to dismiss primitive peoples in the way that that's often read. Or part of Freud's larger point is that people are not irrational, himself and the modern world included. But the other thing is, so he also engaged in psychical research. He encouraged some of his students to explore it more. He joined the British Society for Psychical Research personally, and he says in a letter that came from, I forget, the 1920s, that if he had it all to do over again, he might research the occult. So, so Freud was definitely not a disenchanter in that particular way, even as he was skeptical about institutional religion and so on. But again, that's why disaggregating secularization and disenchantment is important for as an analytic. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is I recently finished Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and as an appendix, he has one of those that letters of that famous encounter that he had with Jung over the reality of telepathy and these quote unquote paranormal phenomena. Yeah. And I had always, just in passing, had heard about this episode and took it as, Freud was just, completely taken aback, couldn't believe in it. When I actually read the letter, he is obviously skeptical at this point, but he was a lot more soft on it than I had come to believe. And so confronting that with your portrait of Freud, it is funny how we often, like a sort of simplistic ideas. Carl Jung was very open to the paranormal, very open to all of this stuff. And Freud was his arch nemesis. And that was the sort of downfall of their relationship. And this very simplistic, nice black and white story that just doesn't pan out in reality.
Yeah, totally. And indeed, that's the version of the narrative that Jung, in a way, promoted. And it was part of how he would like to retroactively describe his split with Freud. I mean, Jung had a very intense spiritual life. And we know from things like the Red Book and elsewhere that Jung, had his own mystical experiences and things like that. And did some of his earliest work on mediumship and psychical mediumship. But Freud was much more open-minded. He was like, by default, a kind of skeptical guy, but he was much more open to those beliefs than the classical narrative depicts. And there's another, and I was just glancing at it because I was trying to remember the name of it. There's like a movie, A Dangerous Method, the Cronenberg film, 2011, that depicts that encounter in a way between Freud and Jung, but it totally reproduces Jung's version of it. And whereas Freud's version of it, he's much more like, yeah, I'm sort of like skeptical, but like I'm not closing the door. You know what I mean? So. And so that anyway, so right, so there's a sort of myth about how that particular rupture occurred, and that's not the best way to understand the split between Jung and Freud. And there are like a lot of there are a lot of different ways to understand how they fell out, and they fell out in a range of different ways. And there are political differences. There's a whole range of things, So yeah.
I watched that movie, A Dangerous Method, with my mother, which was a really bad decision because there's so much like sexual, because they're dealing with the psychological and the repression and all of the self. It was horrible. Anyways, I thought everyone would want to know that, including my mother, who does listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
Adults are talking here, John. No, thank you so much for that. So I am kind of curious. This is something, I don't know if you even address it in your written work, is you're dealing with stuff that a lot of other scholars I know won't touch. They're dealing with, concepts of disenchantment and this sort of stuff, and it's intertwining of enchanted viewpoints with a lot of the heroes of academia historically. What motivated you to really look into this subject? I know you bring up, I believe it was your grandmother in one of your books. Is that correct? I hope I have that right.
Yeah, so that's part of it. So concretely, what inspired me to do this particular book, I was in Japan doing fieldwork for what I thought was going to be my second book. To take a long story short, that book was about kind of persistence of techno-animism in Japanese modernity. And when I was talking to folks about it, they kept describing Japan as mystical and the West as disenchanted. And I knew that was false because I had grown up in a kind of more New Age milieu. And then, I knew that was false for a bunch of different reasons, or I suspected it was false for a bunch of different reasons. And that it was like a Orientalist cliche, basically, of a mystical Asia and a disenchanted West. One of the personal inspirations for me was, my grandmother. So my grandmother was a famous anthropologist, Felicitas Gutmann, whose book, I always forget which is the film title, which is the Exorcism of Annalisa Michel became The Possession of Emily Rose. I forget whether it's Possession of Emily Rose or Exorcism of Emily Rose.
It's The Exorcism of Emily Rose,
yeah. And so Shore Agaladishu, the woman from The Expanse, who's like the cursing old grandmother, plays my grandmother in that movie, which is also weird. My grandmother never cursed, but in certain respects was like her. Anyway, otherwise it's like a fitting casting. So my grandmother was someone who, was an anthropologist, did her early work on glossolalia, so speaking in tongues, and did field work among Mayan Pentecostal communities in Mexico, and then was brought on to consult in cases of quote unquote possession, in particular a case in modern Germany where a young girl parents believed that she was possessed and brought in an exorcist and took her off antipsychotic medication, and she ended up dying. And so my grandmother kind of was a consulting anthropologist on that afterwards, in the trial. But my grandmother later in life moved to New Mexico, and where she kind of became more open about or maybe changed her beliefs anyway, and became open to the existence of spirits. And so and I spent a lot of time with my grandmother growing up, in part because my parents are also academics and would leave me with my grandmother for long periods of time, me and my brother with my grandmother for long periods of time. And my grandmother's a very interesting person, very charismatic, and who, I remember she would mix chicken blood with cornmeal and leave it out for the spirits in the morning. And so really kind of adopted kind of spirit belief and international, she was also quite well-known academic, and people would come to the community that she started, a Cuimongue community, which is on the edge of the Poake Reservation in New Mexico. And they would come to participate in these various trance workshops and ecstatic dance experiences. And I'm always a skeptic of all of it, but I just admired her so much as a person. I had, a lot of my training is as a philosopher, but I kept being interested in the complexities of belief that people have. And, she was just a really inspiring person. And there was no way in which, and she had a version of a kind of disenchantment narrative that was one of her motivators for her spirit stuff. So she thought that civilization had gone wrong in agriculture, basically, and that we had lost touch with nature, and also lost touch with the kind of spirit world. And so this was part of a broad, like we might think of it as a Rousseauian trend in contemporary anthropology. Thinkers like James Scott do it in a non-spiritual way, against the grain, if as a kind of anyway. If you want to read more versions of that, we see it also in Graeber and Wengrew's work as well, but without this extra spirit belief part. And she had this extra spirit belief part. So anyway, I think that was part of what drew me to it. I think also as a thinker, what I'm interested in, I've been thinking a lot about the categories of religion and science and how they're articulated and debated, and in a way that I sort of suspend those categories. And one of the things that I discovered very early, and this is even in my first book, The Invention of Religion in Japan, where I looked at Japanese thinkers encountering the terms religion and science for the first time and trying to figure out what they meant in the 19th century. It was a kind of reversed ethnography of the West as seen from the outside. And in that particular text, what I discovered was that religion and science were being treated as binary opposites, but there was a third term, a notion of superstition, often with magic as its paradigmatic exemplar, that was neither considered like from the perspective of religion, bad religion, and from the perspective of science, bad science. And both terms were, religion and science were defining themselves by trinary exclusion, and particularly policing the overlaps between religion and science. And so anyway, looking at that history, that was already there in the first book, and then I just shifted geographies with the second book. But in general, I kind of sometimes think of myself as, what is it, like emperor's no new clothes, kind of. Like I often just wonder, like kind of dumb things, like why did we get the view of something or another? And often it turns out that like something, I look into it and then I'm like, okay, that makes sense, I understand, and there's nothing interesting for me to say. But sometimes I look into it, I'm like, how did we get the idea that the contemporary world is disenchanted? Or where did this particular notion of postmodernism come from? Or like, why does everybody in my nearby academic disciplines use this word genealogy in this really weird way that doesn't involve ancestry, but seems to refer to some kind of critical history? And then sometimes going back into that in a kind of naive way has allowed me to uncover things that people have taken as status quo assumptions in various disciplines based on sedimentations that, old historical narratives that are have been baked in without being challenged. And so that's the other thing I kind of try and do intellectually.
For our listeners who've got a taste for this now and are wanting more, where else can our listeners get more from you and your work? What else is out there for them to track down on you and about you and by you?
Yeah. So
other than enrolling in your courses.
Yeah. So first, if you Google me right now, I think even just Jason Storm, you'll hit my Williams page, which has all four of my names, Jason, Ananda, Josephson, Storm on it. And on there, I post like as a professional page, and it has links to some of my books and articles. And I'm always, I do office hours with the world 1 hour a week during the academic semester. It sometimes competes with when students here need me, like during finals, I don't do that office hours with the world, but otherwise I try and do that. I Zoom with people basically in my office hours with the world and chat with people all over the globe. Concretely, I have 3 books out and a 4th book coming out in April. The first of those is The Invention of Religion in Japan, then The Myth of Disenchantment, which we talked about, and Metamodernism we talked about. The new book is The Genealogy of Genealogy, Nietzsche, Foucault, and the Coils of Critical History, which provides a critical history of critical history, like it wants to try and figure out why we love debunking the past, and what history, why we prefer certain modes of historical writing. It's also a history of history departments and a history of the relationship between philosophy and history in various academic disciplines. So it's an attempt to rethink my own remaining methodological plank. Basically, I spent my first 2 books was basically applying Foucault, and now I had to kind of undercut my own Foucauldianism by turning it back on itself. So that's that book. That gives you some sense. I have 2 books in progress. One is called Glimmering Gods of the Electric Age, which is the book I was originally going to write between my Japan book and The Myth of Disenchantment, but it's about specifically the history of electricity and how the cultural history of electricity shaped notions of religion and science in ways that and contributed to what a kind of techno-animism, although I may ditch that term eventually. But anyway, instead of stripping away belief in agency, electricity often concretely was understood as an intermediary between body and mind, between soul, or as a kind of soul or vital force, or as a kind of
Like
source of
Frankenstein.
religiosity, like Frankenstein, exactly. And so I trace a history of that, basically global history, starting in Japan with how Thomas Edison became a Shinto god in Japan, and then a history that goes basically from the 18th century down to the 20th. And then another book I'm working on in parallel is about retheorizing power. Because I think we need a new theory of power in the humanities and social sciences. So those are the two ongoing projects that I'm working on. And but yeah, you can Google me and find my webpage. I also have a blog I don't post to very often called Absolute Disruption, but I probably haven't posted in like more than a year, maybe two. So yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome. So the world isn't getting less spiritual, or the West isn't getting less spiritual. It's just getting less religious.
It's getting
Generally
weirder.
speaking, it's
We're getting weirder.
That quotation that he had of what was it? It's like where God disappears, ghosts take their place, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That is. I remember that it was in his book, and that is just like so like enlightening, because it's so true. Like I meet so many people who it's just like, oh yeah, organized religion, I'm not into that, I just don't get it, and stuff like that. But then you probe, and then they're like reading their horoscopes, or like visiting mediums, or they have all these different other beliefs, and it's just like, where are you, what?
When the Geist is gone, the Geists go nuts, right? Like, yeah, it's almost like that biblical story where if you cast out a demon, but you don't fill it with something else, 7 more will come back and take its place. Like, I mean, not to demonize everyone other than traditional religion.
And also, I don't think that's what that parable's about, but there you go. Yeah.
No, but yeah, like what manner of horrors comes rushing in?
Yeah. No, and it's so true, because, like, I think I've done a little bit of study on this, and something like 29% of people right now classify themselves as religious nuns. Not not like,
I love that
Catholic nuns.
every single time we have this conversation, there's like a 30-second clarification that we're not talking about Catholic nuns.
Because people ask me about this. They ask me, it's like, 30% of people are not, that doesn't even make any sense,
Closeted nuns.
Yeah, it's like entire states are nothing but nuns, right? Nunneries.
Utah, it's just up in the mountains.
That
Just
would
all
make
these
sense.
nuns.
Nobody's heard from Utah in a while. I wonder what's going on with it. Sorry, Utah listeners. So 29% are nuts. 29% of people
29% are nuts?
nuns.
Okay, I heard nuts.
Okay, nuns, religious nuns. Like when you ask them what religion are you, they say I'm none. I don't have a religion.
Yeah.
But of those, I think, man, I could be getting my statistics mixed up. It's like 72% of them hold to some spiritual belief or believe in some higher power, something along those lines. So if you like do the actual math, these spiritual but not religious people, whether they call themselves or not, the people who hold the spiritual beliefs but aren't religious, are as big of a demographic as basically all evangelicals are.
Yeah, and they're just like, they're still having that intimacy and relationship in some way. They just don't want to define it. They don't want to put a label on it. I don't, why do we need to define what we're doing? Like, this is good. We're interacting with some sort of celestial, spiritual something, but we don't need to label it. We're not in a relationship. I'm not part of a religion. It's...
Yeah, no, it's the skepticism of institutionalized religion, and yet it's still scratching an itch, the spiritual itch that we all want to have.
The spitch.
That just sounds all horrible. Now I'm going to have to cut that.
No, you don't have to cut it. It's not horrible.
I'm totally cutting that.
Don't cut it. You're like the secularists who cut off the parts of the world that they don't like. You're disenchanting our conversation by removing my swear words.
One of us has to be. So I know you are not as familiar with his works as I am. What were your thoughts on it?
Honestly, I was paying less attention to him and more to just how giddy you were to have him on the show, because
I was giddy.
Seth's a huge fan of Dr. Storm, which I love. It makes it sound like Seth's reading comic books and he just loves Dr. Storm. But no, I thought it was great to have him on, and it was just to have someone who's so articulate and intellectual like that, hearing him talk, you're like, that's an intellectual. Like, that guy knows his stuff, right?
Encyclopedic memory.
Yeah, and usually a lot of the time you associate those types of figures, you know, who are bringing up Foucault and these types of things, you associate them with a certain type of intellectual who is skeptical of all things spiritual and religious. But he's sort of turning that on its head by saying, hey guys, actually, the world's getting more spiritual, not less. And he's almost like one of those traditional intellectuals, but on a different side of the conversation from where you'd normally expect to find them. And I think part of his whole point is it's a myth that they were ever on one side rather than the other. You know, intellectuals are on all sides of these things. Yeah, go ahead.
And he's citing like people like, and you think it sounds like if you're just listening, it sounds like he's just like reading off a sheet of paper, like all these facts and figures and stuff. He wasn't. He has them memorized. They're all in his brain. John, who can't remember anything, can barely remember my name.
What?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sorry. No, I forgot that I didn't remember things. I was just like, oh, that's sad to hear.
Yeah, well, I'm the one who forgot that Star Wars got nominated Best Picture, so.
Yeah. Boo.
That was a bad one, because I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Okay, Arrival had something. There was something about Arrival, like, and award shows that it got something first. Comment if you know, because it's gonna bug me to death.
Oh, I love that you just said comment if you know. We need to start getting people to comment to boost the views. Hello, everyone. If you're listening, please comment, please like, please subscribe.
I'm not actually trying to beg for views or anything.
No, I am. That's what I'm doing. I'm begging, please.
But you are.
I'm so desperate. I need your love and attention and affirmation, and perhaps even a few dollars if you want to join a membership or join Patreon. Please indulge us.
Well, people will. Here's the thing: people will comment all the time to correct me, and for once, I'm like, I might as well lean into it. Just tell me what I got wrong, guys. Tell me what I got wrong.
I love that a lot of the comments on our stuff that we get on YouTube or other channels, they're often negative, right? Or like saying you guys are idiots. But those comments really help drive up the views, because the more comments we get, the more the algorithm.
We've ever done.
Yeah, I'll often engage those people like, why do you think I'm an idiot? And then we'll have like 10 comments going back and forth, and they're just like doing paragraphs of critique and wrath. And I'm like, thank you. If you strike me down, I'll come back more powerful than you can imagine, baby. Bringing it back to Star Wars.
I mean, here's the thing. We're doing controversial stuff, so of course people are going to hate us for it. I mean, we don't even like each other, Jonathan and I, if you can't tell.
Oh, you guys might not have picked up on it, but the first half of that interview, Seth was so mad that I was talking at all because he was so excited to talk with this guest. He was so excited to have this guest on the show. He just wanted them all for himself. And I could just tell. He's like, John, shut up. I want to talk to this guy.
Shut up. I tried to invite you into the call. I brought up Arrival for you, Mr. Movie Critic Guy.
Thank you. You are a beautiful
What year was
soul.
it made?
Is that 2000, I don't know, 11? 15, 14?
You know these by heart.
I don't know.
Always does.
I don't know. 2015.
Okay, so besides literally staring deep into my love drunk eyes, what else did you find it interesting about this? Because I was excited to introduce his work to you.
Yeah. I mean, I loved it. I mean, and it's all the things you've been talking about for a long time. It just much more articulate and well thought through.
I won't even disagree.
And sophisticated. No,
I won't even disagree.
I think I love just how fundamental it goes. Like, often people are having these debates about, you know, what's the evidence for God or not God? But like this is getting to what is at the heart of how we assume and frame our entire worlds, right? Like, because most of us just have this frame that religion's sort of a relic, or it's outdated, and the modern scientific world has kind of moved beyond it. And even if we still believe in God, we have to find some way to make it work within that framework. Like, oh no, God is actually scientifically provable, or something like that. We're still assuming the framework itself. And the beauty of these types of projects is they're actually saying, well, wait, do we have to take this framework at all? Is this even correct? Did we really have this disenchantment? Did science do that? Or is this part of the myth that we've created in our modern world? And there's totally other ways to frame our entire outlook and paradigms for life. And I think those are the really good conversations that we need to be having. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I totally think that, like, the next conversations that we need to be having are not, is the world like secularism versus non-secular religious viewpoints, but different versions of enchanted viewpoints. I really do think that is the like, we have misdiagnosed the world if we think that a couple hundred years from now everyone's going to be atheist and no one's going to believe in anything spiritual. There's a really interesting statistic that he has in the book, which he's citing a different work, but it's like the number of paranormal beliefs in America by 2050 will go up by 14%. So people are beginning to believe more in this stuff, not less. And there's a reason like hunting Bigfoot or ghost hunting things are just so stinking popular. I watch them occasionally. I like them.
Yeah. No, and it's, like, even just
our most
like
popular episode is on like telepathy and exorcisms.
Yeah, people want to know the paranormal, and like, even just in my own life, like this week, I got some of my clothes dirty. I threw them on the floor, and I came back the next day, and they weren't there on the floor anymore. They were cleaned and dried and in the closet. Now, I don't think a materialistic, scientific, atheistic worldview can explain that. Like, who did that?
And we know your wife doesn't love you enough to do that, so...
Well, I don't know why you want to bring her into this. That's, but like, I think there needs to be more to explain the phenomenon of our lives. And I don't think the modern materialistic worldview is doing that. So
what an awful way to end this podcast.